Welcome everyone, I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Grassroots Seed Propagation of Native Plants. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our programs to a broader audience. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they are largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. Our Focus on Sustainability partners are the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, Deep Roots Kansas City, Rescape California, the American Public Gardens Association, and the Ecological Landscape Alliance. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Heather McCargo. Heather is the founder and executive director of the Wild Seed Project, a Maine-based 501c3 nonprofit that works to increase the use of seed-grown native plants in all landscape settings. Wild Seed Project publishes an annual magazine, The Wild Seed, which it sells seeds of locally grown wild-type native plants and educates the public so that a wide range of people can participate in increasing native plant populations. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. It feels very strange not to see any faces. I'm someone who's used to doing public presentations. So I will give it a go with no faces. So I'm pleased to be here and share with you my passion for growing native plants from seed. And as Penny said, we are a young Maine-based nonprofit. I'm the founder, and central to our work is demystifying native seed sowing. I've been propagating native plants for over 3 decades, including my time at Garden in the Woods when I was head propagator there in the 90s. I got my start back in college when I apprenticed to Jack Alexander, who was the propagator at the Arnold Arboretum. And I've grown thousands of different native species from seed, from the easy to the too hard. And I've been teaching how to do this for decades also. And one of my feelings has always been, this is not rocket science. A lot of different people could be doing this. So I had an idea 6 years ago to create this organization and start a grassroots movement to propagate the plants, so that everybody can do this, because we have a big problem on our hands and we need both professionals propagating these plants and amateurs. Today, what I'm going to do is go you through some of the different seed ripening and sowing needs of wild plants using some typical examples. And then I'm going to walk you through simple outdoor seed propagation methods that anybody can do without expensive facilities. So I want to start with what is a seed. And in this photo here is 3 different native species. On the left is the wild lily, Canada lily. In the middle is witch hazel, and on the right is milkweed. And you can see the seeds out of their pods, and that seed is an embryonic plant with a root and shoot connective tissue. And seeds usually contain some food that can be starchy or oily or high in protein. That's the part that we and other animals like to eat. And then they have a protective cover. The seeds form in the ovary of the mother plant, and this mature ovary can be thin and dry, like in these pods here, or it can be thick and fleshy, like in a fruit. So the seed is what represents the next generation, and it's the result of sexual reproduction between 2 or more individuals, and each one, again, is genetically unique, and that's the really important feature. So if any of you have siblings and with even the same 2 parents how different all the different offspring can be in the same family, that's true in the plant world too. So I am now going to walk through about 20 different species, showing you the different the flowers and then the ripening characteristics and how you handle the seeds. And then I'll get to the simple methods of how you can sow these seeds. So I'm going to start with the slowest to propagate and grow and also the most challenging. And these are mostly the woodland wildflowers. And in this picture, you're looking at the yellow is trout lily and the white is wood anemone. And many of these woodland wildflowers have seeds that cannot dry out, and the seeds are dispersed by ants. So these two species bloom in early spring. They're true spring ephemerals, which means they go dormant usually by mid-June. And we'll look at the trout lily in the middle. That's one of our native lilies. And after it flowers, it's pollinated by early spring little tiny bees, actually. And then it forms a tan pod that, when ripe, is about 1/2 inch across, and the whole rest of the plant has nearly disappeared. When the seeds ripen, the pod splits open and ants come grab the seed. The wood anemone there, that one gets a cluster of little green seeds, and I'll explain how those are handled in a minute. This is bloodroot, another spring ephemeral, although up here in Maine, this one tends to stay green all summer long, but farther south, it tends to go dormant midsummer. So it's another early spring blooming wildflower that's pollinated by lots of teeny native bees and flies. And after the flower goes by, a green kayak-shaped pod forms. And after about 6 or 7 weeks, that pod is about 2 inches long, and it will split, and out will drop a bunch of brown seeds with a little white fleshy protrusion. And it's that little protrusion that's high in fats and proteins that the ants like, and the ants come and carry those seeds off. So if you're not there right when these ripen on that, literally within an hour, the ants all find them and carry them off. And these seeds, if they need a warm period and then a cold period before they would germinate. So the ants carry them off to their nest, bury them sort of in the ant equivalent of a compost pile, and then if it stays moist all summer, they will germinate the next spring. And then the trilliums, these are not difficult wildflowers to propagate if you know how to handle them. However, they're extremely slow growing. So if you look at the picture on the right, there you can see that creamy, fleshy thing on the little brown seeds. That's what the ants are after. So, we've got a handful of different trillium species native in New England, and this is the purple trillium that tends to bloom in early May, in Maine anyways, and then it's really 3 months later before that pod is ripe, and it's about 1 inch across. On this species, it's that dark purple color. On other species, it's just green. And that pod stays firm all summer, and then usually in late July or early August, suddenly it gets soft and drops off. And again, the ants are there within an hour, and they're after that little fleshy protrusion. So the seeds get carried off to the ant nest, maybe 20 feet maximum away, and then they will lay under the leaf litter, and they will not germinate the next spring. It will be the following spring. So it literally goes through 2 winters before they germinate. In that first summer, you'll have teeny little, so that's now spring of year 2, you will have a little 1 inch seedling, one single leaf that's about 1 inch long and maybe 1/4 of an inch wide. The third summer, you will get the classic 3 little leaves of a trillium on maybe a stem that's 3 or 4 inches tall. And then typically they're 7 years before they bloom. So it's not difficult, it's just slow. And that's why this wildflower is one that will never be widely produced by the nursery trade. And I really discourage people from coveting these in their garden unless you're willing to pay the price for the people who are propagating them. And you have to, as a propagator, you have to have access to the fresh seed. So those are a couple examples of some of the woodland wildflowers that really give native seed propagation, make people think they can't do it because they're more challenging. And then there's the species like the lady slipper orchids that are really dependent on mycorrhizal fungi in the soil for their whole life cycle. So the pink lady slipper tends to be in the oak, pine, or hickory forest. It blooms usually in late May and early June. It's pollinated by bumblebees. And remember, the pollinating insects, they're after nectar and pollen. They're after food. They don't know that they're helping move the pollen between plants. So the bee has to squeeze down through the little opening in the pink pouch, and then it goes down to the bottom. It rubs itself across the pollen, but there's no nectar in this plant. So if you look at a population of lady slipper orchids, typically only about 10% of the flowers get pollinated, because I think bumblebees are smart, and after they visited a few flowers, they move on to a different species. Luckily, one pod will produce thousands and thousands of teeny dust-like seeds. And this is another reason this species is dependent on fungi in the soil. The seed has no food reserves in it, like think of an acorn, that nut, that's a lot of food reserve for the germinating seed. These don't have that, so they're dependent on fungi for their germination and growth. So this is a great example of a wildflower that is not propagatable. Some of the other showy lady slipper and yellow lady slipper, they can be propagated from divisions. And now there are some laboratories that are cloning them via tissue culture, but that's not doing anything for the genetic diversity of the plant. So these are ones, I think, for to get people away from coveting in their garden, and particularly the pink lady slipper, because nobody's propagating them. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the species that have seeds that stay green when they ripen. Again, this is more the early blooming flowering plant. So this is Marsh Marigold, and it tends to bloom for about 3 weeks in May. And then after the flower goes by, on the picture on the left, you can see the yellow flowers, and then just below it, you can see some of the seed pods forming that cluster of green pods. And then on the picture on the right, you can see them when they're ripe, which is usually about also a month to 6 weeks later. The pods open up and are star-like, and then they'll split along the seam and have these little green seeds that will drop out. And in the wild, where this is a wetland plant, and where the seeds want to drop out is on some damp mud. So in wetlands, the water level tends to be higher in the spring, like in May, and then by June, mid-June, when the seeds are ripening, the water level has dropped down a little bit, and the seeds will drop on the damp mud, be under the shade of the foliage of the plant or other shrubs and trees, and that's the perfect situation for these seeds to germinate. And they'll actually germinate within a month, given shade and landing on damp soil surface. Other species that are like this are willow. They also disperse their seeds. They're green, they have a little fluffy appendage, and then they need to land on damp mud to germinate. Then a lot of our shrubs, like this is, the picture on the top is alternate leaf dogwood. So all the dogwood, shrub dogwoods and tree dogwoods and viburnums, they all have these mostly white frothy flowers. A few of them, like the big black dogwood, have more what looks like classic flower petals, but they're not. They're all pollinated by small pollinating bees and flies. And then they get these fleshy fruits. So below, you're looking on the left, that's Viburnum lentego. Those seeds turn from yellow to pink to blue to black, and then they're ripe. The middle is the true high bush cranberry, and the right is silky dogwood. All these fleshy fruits are ripen in usually August and September. They're all high in protein and fats, perfect for our migrating songbirds, and that's who typically disperse these seeds. And for the propagator, you need to collect them when the seeds are ripe, remove the fleshy fruit, and then sow them when they're moist. The seeds can't dry out, or they won't germinate. And that's typical of quite a few of our fleshy fruit native plants. Then all of our nuts, this is American hazelnut, but also all our tree nuts like oak, hickory, beech, then our maples and basswood, those all have seeds that when they ripen, you collect them and need to sow them right away. So the challenge, particularly with the nuts, is to get them when they are actually ripe, but before the squirrels and chipmunks get them, and they are very effective at seeking them out as soon as they ripen. So you collect the nuts, remove the husk, and I like to soak them overnight in a bucket of water, and any nuts that float to the surface, it means some little insect made it its home, and there are lots of native insects whose whole life cycle is dependent on that nut. So it's not that it's a pest, but those are the seeds that won't germinate. So then you take the say acorn, and if you're not prepared to sow it right away, you need to put it in a Ziploc bag in the refrigerator. They cannot, if you even leave them on your kitchen counter for a day or two, or in your car, you will kill these seeds. They need to be sown fresh right away. But before you sow them outdoors, you have to have heavy-duty wire screening to protect them from rodents, squirrels, chipmunks, mice. So if you're not prepared to do that, stick them in a Ziploc bag in your refrigerator and get that set up. And if you've kept them in a Ziploc bag and they haven't dried out, that can count as their winter stratification, and then you can sow them outdoors in late March or early April. But again, having rodent-proof structures to keep them away is really important with all the nut trees. Doesn't matter, I don't have trouble with the maples, but the nut trees and shrubs are a real problem with the rodents. Okay, now moving on to, there are some species that have fleshy fruits that the seeds can be stored dry, and the jack-in-the-pulpit is an example of that. Jack-in-the-pulpits are the northernmost member of what's mostly a tropical family. And so unlike, most flowers have both male and female sex organs, and so they have both male and female parts and will produce seeds. Then there are some species, and holly is the one that people are familiar with, that have separate male and female plants, so you have to have both. And jack-in-the-pulpit also has separate male and female plants. The flowers are actually below that green and purple striped area, so you can't tell when you're looking at the flower when it's in bloom if it's male or female. You can tell later when the females are the ones that get the fruits, and they start off shiny and emerald green, and then when they're ripe, they turn bright red. The other thing that's unusual about jack-in-the-pulpit is the plants themselves can switch back and forth from being male or female. So one year they might be male, and the next year they might be female. It tends to take more energy to produce fruits than to disperse pollen. So after droughty years or stressful years, more of the plants tend to be male. So you can take those fleshy fruits and just squeeze the seeds out and sow them right away, or you can clean them and store them dry. And oddly, this probably is a good hint of its tropical origins. These seeds do not need a winter outside to germinate, so you can just sow them outdoors in the spring. I do all my seed sowing of them after I collect them in the fall, and they are one of the last seeds to germinate in the spring. Again, I think their tropical roots tell them to wait till the real heat of summer before they germinate. Now I'm going to move into some of the species that have seeds that can be stored dry but need a winter cold period outside to germinate. And so violets is a classic example of that. They're one of the early spring bloomers, and we have about 25 species of violets in May. They're pollinated by early bees, and after they bloom, those flowers turn into about a ½ inch long green pod that when they kind of are hooked and face down the way that flower in the middle that's not open is. And then once the day or so before the pod is ripened, it points upwards and then splits open, and you'll see a whole bunch of little golden brown seeds inside. Those seeds will then fall off the plant, and they do have a teeny little fleshy protrusion that ants like and will carry off and eat that and then bury them. Or you can just collect them and store them dry in a paper bag and sow them outside, how I'm going to show you in a bit. Now, violets, I don't know, they must have evolved where we have a lot of rain. You know, over the millions of years that these plants have been around, we must have rainy springs, must be in their ancestry. So they have a secondary emergency strategy, which you can see on the right, where I pulled up this plant in midsummer. And they produce flowers that never open. Instead, they burrow underground. That's what you see on the right. And they make seeds without sexual reproduction. It's the same thing that happens with peanuts. Peanuts are actually a flower that burrows underground. And so those seeds aren't quite ripe that you're seeing in that picture, but those are not genetically diverse seeds. Those are actually clones of the mother plant. And it's sort of like a secondary strategy for when there's a bad pollinator year. Now I'm going to show you a couple examples of seeds that are harder to find if you don't get them right when they're ripe. This is wild geranium, and they tend to bloom in late May. And if you look at the flower in the couple of flowers on the upper right, you can see after the flower goes by, you'll see these green, they're sometimes called crane's bill because they have this long, what looks like a crane's bill that's green. And then the picture on the right is showing them when they're ripe. They turn black and then spring off from the plant. And that happens in a patch of wild geranium. That happens over a period of about 2 weeks, and it happens daily. So to collect these seeds, I have to get out every day and collect them because they go from green to black and springing off within 24 hours. You know, in the wild, what happens? They hopefully land under the leaf litter, make their way under the leaf litter, and then wait through the winter and will germinate the next spring. Also, bluets are another one that they're easy to see when they're in bloom. And this is a great plant. People often have it in their lawn or wet areas or meadows. But what people don't realize is they end up mowing them after the bloom's done and the seeds have not ripened. So these are tiny little plants, only a couple inches tall, and the seed pod is only about 1/4 of an inch across. It starts off green and then it turns tan, and that's when you can snip it off with scissors, and then you get these little teeny seeds inside that you can either sow right away or you can store them dry and sow them outdoors in the fall. But if you don't mark these plants well, it's really hard to find the seeds. Okay, now I'm going to show you a bunch of species that are easy to find the seeds when they're ripe. And they're the ones that the seeds tend to ripen in the summer or fall. And so this is red columbine, a great hummingbird plant and also pollinated by bees. And after these flowers go by, you'll see these green, spidery looking, upright facing pods that end up turning tan and papery and split, and you'll see the little black seeds inside. And they tend to take a couple weeks of windy weather to disperse all their seeds. They're little black seeds, very easy to collect them and put them in a paper bag and then sow them outside later. Wild iris or blue flag iris, this one's a late spring or early summer bloomer, and there's a lot of this plant in wet meadows and roadside ditches. And one of the things that most people don't recognize with native plants is how long it can be from when it flowers to when the seeds ripen. And so most of these wild irises that are growing in our roadside ditches or even in meadows end up getting mowed down before the seed ripens. So this gets a 2 or 3 inch long green pod that ripens usually in September. When it's ripe, it starts to turn tan and splits open, and you'll see all these closely packed, shiny brown seeds. Very easy to collect. A clump like this will produce thousands of seeds. Again, each one will be genetically diverse individual, but if you mow the area before they get to ripen, you keep that next generation from getting out there in the world. It's a perennial plant, so it will live for many years, but this is one of the many ways we are really setting back our native plants, is we are mowing them away. The ones that are still in the open meadow areas, these areas are getting mowed before the native seeds are ripe. So these seeds need a winter cold period outside to germinate, but very easy to grow from seed. Wild strawberry. So a nice patch of this can produce lots of seeds, so you have to wait till the fruit is ripe, which can be hard because you want to eat it. But how I collect the seeds of this, I pick the fruits and smear them on a piece of cardboard or paper, and then you can just fleck the seeds off later and sow them outdoors in the fall. You can store these seeds dry. All are different milkweed species. This is the rose or swamp milkweed. Here in Maine, it tends to bloom in usually early July, bloom for about 3 weeks. It's a great pollinator plant. It's not just the monarch butterfly who love this plant. Lots of other pollinating insects make use of the foliage and nectar on this plant. So these seeds tend to ripen late in Maine, late September, probably farther south in Massachusetts or Connecticut. It might be even as early as late August, but the green pod will turn tan and then split. And the trick with the milkweeds is to get them just as they're splitting. That's the easiest time to then separate the seeds from the fluff. Once they've fluffed out, the easiest way to separate the seeds out is to put them in a paper bag and shake them vigorously, and then go outside, open the bag, and the fluff will blow away and you'll have the seeds on the bottom. And you can store milkweed seeds dry till you're ready to sow them. Bunchberry. Bunchberry is a circumboreal plant, so it's one that is already in southern New England, not thriving. And even in Maine, we are really seeing the effects of climate change. Where it still thrives in Maine is in the coastal boreal forest area and up in the mountains. But very easy to collect the fruits when they're ripe. Usually it's in early August, and you have to separate the seeds out from the fruit. I put them in a Ziploc bag and smush them in the bag, let them ferment for a week or two, and then separate out the flesh, clean the seeds, and you can sow them right away, or you can store them dry for a couple months. But they need a long winter outside, again, probably hinting to their roots in the more boreal zones. They really need a 4 or 5 month winter, not a 2 or 3 month winter. So it's getting to the point where now it's too late to really sow those seeds outside. And they also don't germinate till really the heat of summer. So it must be something they learned from their life in the far north, that if you germinate too early, you can get hit by some Arctic cold. This is Cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis, and this picture shows really how this plant wants to grow, which is in shady stream sides or pond sides. And I find in the wild, these populations really fluctuate a lot year to year. The year that I took this picture was, I think it was 2015 or 16 that we had that really heavy snow winter. And so when the water retreated, there was a lot of damp mud, and that's where these seeds want to germinate. So you look on the far side of this picture, you can see that mud across it. And if you look at these flowering stalks, you can see the green ripening seeds on the left. The pods turn more tan and they have little dark brown seeds in top side. You can harvest the seeds in a white envelope and hold on to them for a couple months and then sow them outdoors. And they do not like to be buried. They need to be sowed on the soil surface and be kept in the shade till they germinate. And that's typical of seeds. Teeny dust-like seeds are really dependent on being sown on the soil surface, but kept constantly moist and in the shade. Now this is blue vervain. This used to be a really common wetland plant, and with all the invasives like purple loosestrife really push this plant out of a lot of New England wetlands. This is in one of my wet meadows by my pond where I still have a good population. But these bloom in usually late July, but the seeds do not ripen until well into October. So what usually happens with people's meadows and roadsides is they mow these native species long before the seeds are ripened. And so letting our native meadow species grow until September and let all these species disperse their seeds. So these seeds, when they're ripe, they're little kind of coppery brown, long skinny seeds, and you can just store them in a paper bag. You know, one flowering stalk will produce quite a few seeds, and then you sow them outdoors in the fall. Then we've got the species. There are some native species that don't have to go through a winter cold period outdoors. The black-eyed coneflower on the left, and even all the asters do not require a cold period to germinate. The asters, when you collect the seeds, which are ripe in usually not till late October or November, those seeds, however, have to go through a period of what's called after ripening, where they're dry for about a month or two before, you know, they built that insurance in so they won't germinate in a weird warm day in December or something. But otherwise, these species do not actually require a winter cold period outside. That said, they do better when you sow them outdoors in the fall or winter. Black-eyed coneflower is one of the rare wildflower, perennial wildflowers that will bloom the first year from seed, really within 2 months. So that's probably one of our fastest growing ones. And it produces little brown seeds, usually starting in late September, and I collect them all through October. Okay, now before I show you how to sow the seeds, I just want to tell a little cautionary tale about what I don't want to see happen to our native plants now that there's such a big interest in people growing them. And I'm going to use the example of purple coneflower, because back in the early 90s, that's when I was a propagator at Garden in the Woods. Purple coneflower, you know, this was a well-loved American perennial that you know, up until that point, it would, you know, people who were herbalists or perennial gardeners might have grown this plant. And this is what the wild form of purple coneflower looks like. It has petals that droop down. They can range from pale pink to deep pinky purple. They attract a ton of pollinating insects. They can be anywhere from 2 to 4 feet tall. But during the early 90s, one year they won the Perennial Plant of the Year award. And since that time, there's been so much breeding going on with this plant. And you know, there's about a dozen Echinacea species native to mostly Central and some Eastern North America. And that's what all the breedings happened with, hybridizing and making selections. And so today when you go to a nursery, this is typical of what you see, this range of colors. They all have cute, you know, little cultivar names, you know, the little name in parentheses. That picture on the sort of center with where you don't even see the center cone, that's, you know, where the whole sexual parts have mutated and look like sort of aborted petals, you know. So, you know, a lot of this breeding has all happened with a grower in Texas. A lot of these are now patented, so you know, you can't even propagate them if you want to. And most sadly, they've taken what was a really tough native plant that supported a lot of pollinators, was really drought and disease resistant, and turned it into a annual that you have to, you know, buy from the patent holder. So this is something I don't want to see happen with all our northeastern native plants. Another more recent example of a native that's gotten picked up by the nursery trade is this is yellow bush honeysuckle, Daravilla Lunissera, a really great native shrub. When it blooms, it has these yellow flowers that are pollinated by bumblebees. After it's been pollinated, the flowers turn reddish, so you can see the flowers on the bottom haven't been visited by the bees. The one above have. And if you look at the leaf, it has this little purple cast to the leaf. And this plant like a lot of our native, especially woodies, when they leaf out in the spring, if you look at the picture on the left, that's it right in the first week or so when it's leafed out. They tend to have a either reddish or coppery color, and that chemical is to repel early herbivores, whether it's insects or bunny rabbits or deer. You know, our native plants, when they leaf out in the spring, they are desperate to photosynthesize. So they'll have that reddish color, and then it's gone within, you know, a week or two. And that reddish chemical, like I said, is to deter herbivores. So everybody knows how the monarch butterfly needs milkweed as a host plant. It needs the leaves, the foliage of milkweed for its caterpillars to eat. Well, that's not some unique situation in nature. All of our native plants are host plants for different native insects, particularly the butterfly and moth caterpillars. And the yellow bush honeysuckle is the host plant for about a handful of native moth species. And now you're starting to see in nurseries this form that stays red all season. And it was probably not a product of breeding. It was probably just a naturally occurring mutation that happened. So it has to be propagated clonally, you know, by cuttings, or more commonly now through tissue culture. And so that plant now, if you plant a purple leaf form, there's even a variegated form too. It has to be cloned, so there's no genetic diversity, and it won't serve as a host plant to the native butterfly and moth species that needed this plant. This is not what we want to have happen to our native species. We want to grow them from seed. That's where the genetic diversity is. So how do you do that? So I get a lot of people, you know, saying to me, I'm so happy at Wild Seed Project's trying to save the native seeds. I'm like, I'm not trying to get people to save the seeds. I'm trying to get people to sow the seeds. And so really the first step is not collecting the seeds. It's learning to sow the seeds. And so that's the reason we're really dedicated to getting, you know, genetically diverse, both collected from the wild. All our seeds are collected by myself and a team of trained volunteers from our members' properties. We do have some rare species that are just from our stock plants of garden grown seeds, but they're all the wild type. And so that's where I like people to begin. Become a native seed sower. And then if you're interested in learning to collect the seeds, you will learn the whole life cycle of the plant. So if you go to our website, we offer about 75 species of seeds for sale. And so now I'm going to walk you through how you do it. And so, you know, I just ran you through the different strategies that are needed. But the easiest thing to do is just, you know, change your thinking from what you might have been trained with traditional horticulture, which is that seeds need warm, consistent temperatures to germinate. With our native species, the way you do it is you sow them outdoors in the fall or winter. You can still sow them now, and let them go through a winter outdoor. So how I like to have people do that, I really recommend you sow them in pots. You can use clay pots. In fact, clay pots are preferable. The nursery industry, you know, for the last 30 years has really switched to plastic. But, you know, if you're against using plastic, which I'm all for, you can use clay pots. If you are using plastic, you can get plenty of recycled pots out there. And these heavy duty 4 or 5-inch plastic pots do last for years. I use the same pot year after year. And so what I like to have people do is wait till later in the fall. So by fall, I don't mean September. I mean well after the cool weather has set in. So really not starting till mid-November. And I like to get people thinking about sowing the native seeds over the holidays. So Thanksgiving, or the December holidays, you know, anywhere in December through the new year. And you can really do most species into early February. So you can get some good organic potting soil and put it in the pot, press the soil down so that it's firm. Then you can sow the seeds. So you can sow native seeds really thickly. They're very different from annuals or vegetables where you learn that if you sow them too thickly, they all crowd each other out. Native seeds are like teenagers, sow them densely. So these 3 pots, we're looking at black-eyed coneflower. Each of these pots has at least 50 seeds in it. Black-eyed coneflower on the left, New England aster in the middle, and on the right is milkweed. You can see how close they are together. Then I like people to cover the seeds with coarse sand. And a good rule of thumb is to cover the seeds to the depth of the thickness of the seed. So a small seed like black-eyed coneflower just gets a thin coating less than 1/8 of an inch. Same with New England aster. Bigger seeds like the milkweed get more like 1/4 of an inch. You know, so if you're sowing a sesame seed, it would be 1/8 of an inch. If you're sowing an acorn, you want it 1 inch deep. And the reason you want to use coarse sand is sand lets some light through to the seedling, which when people fail with seed sowing, it's often that they buried the seed too deeply. So the sand lets light into the seedlings. It also protects the seeds from splashing out. The grittiness, the seeds grow really well coming up through that grittiness too. You don't get that crustiness that can sometimes happen with the potting soil. The other thing the sand does is it will dry out before the potting soil will dry out. So you can quickly tell glancing at your pot of seeds if they're starting to get dry because the sand will get lighter in color. So you do need to use heavy duty pots, peat pots, those cow pots. You know, the native plants, most of our species are perennials. And grow much slower. Those peat pots and cow pots, they're really designed for quick growing annuals and perennials, and so they will decay before the seedlings have grown enough. Use also, I like to use pencil as opposed to pen on the label because I find the pen doesn't last long enough. And then push the label down, carry them outside, find a flat spot. Flat's really important so they don't get washed, you know, tipped in a heavy rain. In the shade, even if it's sun-loving species, you want to put those flats in the shade and you want to cover them with, this is like that rabbit cage wire. You can get it at any hardware store. Cover them with wire. If you're sowing any of the nuts, you got to do more than cover them with wire. You've got to actually build a cage or a box. You can build most of the box out of wood and then made a lid with the wire that's attached down firmly, and then just leave them through the winter. Rain, snow, sleet, thaws. You know, our seed, the heavy seed coat needs that freeze and thaw of our New England winter to break up the heavy native seed coat. These are not like vegetables and annuals, which are domesticated plants, which have seed coats that have been selected over time to be thin and have quick, rapid germination. These seed coats need that freeze and thaw. And this is the winter stratification. People always want to do it in the refrigerator. It is so much easier to do it outside, and you have much better germination because of that freeze and thaw. And then in late winter, early spring, you will start to see germination. So this is the first week in April, and already some seedlings have started to germinate. Some of those double dormancy ones like Trillium and Trout lily and wild leek and some of those shrub dogwoods and viburnums, they all are some of the earliest to germinate. So they can still germinate when the temperatures still dip below freezing at night. The asters, if you sow them out in the fall or winter, they will germinate really early versus if you sow them when the weather's warm, they take longer. So you get them to germinate early. They get to put a lot of growth in while the weather is still cool. Then this picture is taken sort of probably the 3rd week in May. You can see my neighbor's Norway maple tree has dropped all its aborted Norway maple seedlings. And so if you take, these are just little 4-inch square pots. In 1 square foot, you can have 9 different species, and you can have hundreds of native seedlings germinating. Now, what I like to have people do with those germinated pots is to not divide them all up individually, but instead, as they start to seem crowded, take them, tip the whole pot out and put it in a much bigger pot. So a pot of milkweed seedlings, I put them in a gallon-sized pot, so you can have, 50 milkweed seedlings in that gallon-sized pot. With you can do the same thing with New England aster, penstemon, all these species. Just give them a bigger pot and grow them that way through the summer. I'll show you some species up close. This is wild geranium. You remember I showed you the seeds spring off from the plant? Well, the other thing that some native seeds do is not have all their seeds germinate at the same time. So this is a second-year pot of wild geranium seedlings. So the bigger leaves are the ones that germinated the first year, and then the little round seeds germinated the second year. And that is a really good strategy in a wild plant, to not have all your seeds germinate at the same time, because who knows what the weather's going to be like. And if you really think over the last 5 or 10 years, how many serious droughts we have had in the spring. And a lot of wild plants, when they had seeds germinate in the spring and you have a drought in May, those seedlings end up shriveling up and drying. So this strategy of not putting all your eggs in one basket with a wild seed is a good strategy. This is a little pot of jack-in-the-pulpit seedlings. So there's about 30 seedlings in this little 4-inch square pot. So then what I do is take this little pot and put it in a gallon-sized pot and let it grow on through the summer. And then I would wait till the next spring. You could then divide those up in September and plant them out, or you can overwinter them and then plant them out the next spring, or if you're going to sell them, pot them up individually. Those are about 1 inch tall. This is a pot of about 60 silky dogwood seedlings. This is pictures taken in mid to late June. They've already grown 8 inches, and this is in Maine. I then took this pot and put it in a 2-gallon pot. So these seedlings were about 18 inches tall in September, and then you can divide those up, and if you're going to sell them, pot them, or you can plant them out. If you were smart, you would have, let's say you wanted to make a hedge of silky dogwood, you could have prepared the site over the summer by smothering it with cardboard and mulch and sown these seeds, and then you'd have plants to plant. And this is one of the fastest growing native shrubs. People always want to sow their seeds, just toss it out into the landscape. And the problem with that, our native seeds just don't grow as fast as the weeds that are out in the landscape. And so that's why sowing them, when you sow the seeds in the pots, you can make nursery beds with good weed-free soil, but really it's not an effective strategy. You waste a lot of seed. So, I did write a blog on native seed bombs. I think if you really are excited about doing some seed sowing strategy grassroots strategy out in the wild, make little seed bombs where you just put a small pinch of the picture on the upper left, just has 3 milkweed seeds. It has about 5 aster seeds. Don't make these giant bombs with hundreds of seeds in them. That's just a waste of the seeds. And the little bit of organic matter will help protect the seed, because most of the seed that's dispersed out in nature either gets eaten or blown away or doesn't land in the spot where it wants to be. I was supposed to tell you, sorry. I'm at my last slide now, so if you want to start typing questions into the question box, I really hope you'll go to the Wild Seed Project seed sale page, or the whole website. We have so much great free information. Our seed sale, there's a lot just to learn by reading through all the information about propagating on our seed sale page. We have great blogs. And most recently, we have our Pledge to Rewild, where we're trying to get people to sign the pledge to take on restoring native plants in their landscape. We have a blog that outlines it. And then when you sign the pledge, you get walked through a whole great pathway of learning. Anna Fialkoff will be presenting about this at the ELA conference in March, so you can hear more about it then too. But you know, our native plants are really losing their place in our world. I have been doing this my whole adult life. I studied plant ecology in college back in the late 70s and early 80s, and I have seen all of our native plants, even the common ones, retreating. It is not hard to sow many native species of seeds, and it's a great way to produce a lot of plants. And we need professional nurseries doing this. You can do it as an individual, as a homeowner. You can donate your plants. If you don't need them all in your landscape, you can donate them to a native plant sale. It's a really quick, satisfying way to produce a lot of plants. It's also really fun. You'll feel proud of your little baby plants. It's really a interesting process. You'll really learn to recognize the natives in their seedling form, so that when you're out in nature, you'll start to see the juveniles in the landscape, and then you'll know not to destroy them. So it's really a fun thing to do. So with that, I'll turn it over to Penny to manage any questions people might have.
Excellent. That has just really fired us up to go out and plant some seeds. Can you please explain what you mean by the contribution of 2 or more parent plants contributing to the production of seed, and perhaps give us an example?
Yes. Okay, so everybody knows how pollinators are needed to pollinate the plant. Well, the reason that is, so we do have some plants where the pollen gets from one plant to the other by wind, and that happens with grasses and a lot of trees. But most of our flowering plants need insects, you know, bees and other insects, to transfer the pollen from one individual to the next. Most plants need to be cross-pollinated to produce viable seed. You have to have more than one individual, but it's the pollinating insects who move that pollen from one plant to the next to complete the sexual reproduction, you know, that in humans happens with the sperm and the egg, the male and female, you know, mammal animals. But in plants, it's pollen getting transferred to the ovary in a flower, usually by an insect. And then you get, so, you know, let's say you just had 2 individual plants, you know, some native plant in your garden, you had 2 individuals, so they would cross-pollinate, but those individuals were miles from any other from their species. So all the offspring that you would have of those seeds would be from those 2 individuals, but it would still be, each seed would be completely unique, different combinations of individuals. And that's what genetic diversity is. And the more individuals you have cross-pollinating, you know, the best native seed is seed that's been collected from multiple individuals and even multiple populations of individuals. So we'll take New England aster as a great example, where I collect seed from hundreds of individuals from many different populations to get the maximum genetic diversity in it. You know, some will, you know, like pollution better, some will tolerate heat or drought better, others will tolerate. That's what we need to maintain in our native species in the future. And it's the fundamental problem with cultivars. The problem with cultivars is not that they're not pretty or useful in the garden, it's that they have to be cloned. And so there's no genetic diversity. And if we start planting all our landscapes in clones of native plants, we won't be enhancing, you know, helping them maintain their genetic diversity. We'll be shrinking it more, and it's already shrinking in the wild.
All right, very good. Is it possible to divide and transplant trout lilies in our gardens?
Well, most people don't have it in your garden because it's not a carbon garden plant. You know, it is has a really deep rooted bulb, like amazingly deep. So if it's in your garden and not in the wild, sure, go ahead and try it, and you have to wait until the plant's almost disappeared, because that poor plant only has like a 6-week life cycle. If you dig it up right in the middle of its life cycle, you've really stressed it. But it's amazing how deep down the bulb goes. But if it's in your garden and not in your wild, sure, I'll let you do that.
Okay.
But don't go dig it in the wild. Trout lilies about a dozen years to reach. It's even longer than the Trillium to reach blooming size from seed. So digging plants, taking divisions from the wild is not propagation. You're not making more plants. But if it's in your garden, sure.
Okay. Can you recommend a book that gathers together all of this information other than the 1986 Collecting, Processing, and Germinating Seeds in Wildland Plants by Young and Young?
Well, you can go, so there's a couple books that we use, and that I wrote a great manual for the Maine DOT that you can view on our website. It's under our publications. You can download it. That's more for roadside, so it's a collection. It's the propagation and sowing information on about 35 species of native shrubs and trees. We also have, on our propagation page, there's some of this information. I love Bill Kalina's books that he wrote when he was the propagator after me at Garden in the Woods, and his book on propagating wildflowers and trees and shrubs. There's also my favorite woody propagation book is called Growing Trees from Seed. These are all listed as resources actually on the Wild Seed Project website, by the way. So you can find this there. Also, Michael Durr's reference manual of woody plant propagation, which covers exotics and native species. But that was, back when I was in college and when I was assisting in Jack Alexander at the Arnold Arboretum, that was the go-to reference. And what's pretty interesting when you read that book is back then things were still being grown from seed, and he talks in it about the promise of cloning of plants and how excited everybody was to be able to produce uniform, genetically diverse individuals. And there was no awareness about the loss of genetic diversity that people now have. But that's a great one to turn to also for seed germination information. And my favorite one is called, let me see what the name of it is, Growing Trees from Seed. It's listed on the Wild Seed Project website under our resources. So I use all of those, and I have a lot in my head still, and a handful of other people, but those, you can still get Bill's books, Kalina's books are out of print, but you can usually get them used. But the DOT manual will give you a lot of information. You can download that right from our website or from the Maine public DOT, from the Maine government website too.
Great tips. Can you talk a little bit about collecting sweet fern seeds?
Yeah, you have to be there. They drop off the plant usually up in Maine. It's usually in early, when is it? It's early July, and they're kind of this bristly little cluster, and they drop off. They turn from green to golden, and you have to be there right when they pop off, and you should sow them right away. And they need to be sown outside. I can't tell you how many places I've read that, sweet fern, you can only propagate from divisions. It's not true. However, that's one where, let's say you were able to get 100 seeds. They would have staggered germination over about 5 years. Those seeds have evolved to not all germinate every year because, again, that's a smart strategy in a wild plant. But they need the freeze and thaw. If you sowed them and just stuck them in the refrigerator, like a lot of traditional horticulturalists would for their stratification, there's not enough freeze and thaw to break through that heavy seed coat. So you just got to pay attention. So you got to know where they are, but they're not hard.
Good tips. For plants like wild geraniums and other similar plants, can you tie a little bag around to catch the seeds so you don't lose them?
Yeah, I think you could try that. Sure. I would do like a gauze bag or something, because usually in a patch of wild geranium, it's about a 2-week period, and especially if you wait till most of the flowers have gone by, so you're not preventing, they flower and seed ripening over a 2-week period. So yes, you could do that. And the geranium's another interesting one. You'll sometimes read that those seeds have to be sown right away or they won't germinate. I collect them in a paper bag and store them dry. Typically, they won't all germinate the next year. However, that's not even true. In fact, a year ago, I had my intern, I had a lot of geranium seeds, so I had her count out 200, and then in the spring, we were going to count out what the exact percentage that had germinated. And I was all excited to have her do that, and then they all germinated. So it can really vary from year to year.
Interesting. The roadside germination propagation pamphlet that you talked about, does it provide information like whether or not something has to be chilled first?
Yeah.
And what needs to be sown in fall versus spring? Those kinds of things?
Yeah. Yes, it does.
Okay.
Yes, it does. Again, even with things that can be sown in the spring, I really recommend you sow them in the fall. But what's nice is if you forgot to sow something, and it's like, let's say you forgot to sow asters you want, you can still get away with it in the spring. Yes, I wish we could print and sell more of the DOT manual. We did it up as a nice spiral book, but it's a main government publication, so they're not equipped to do that. So, but you can download all the information. It's freely available to anyone. And you can link to it directly from the Wild Seed Project website under our publications and see all the other. We have so much great writing and how-to blogs on the website also, but all that information's in the DOT manual too.
Okay, very good. How does Lobelia syphilitica compare to Cardinalis in terms of collecting and propagating the seeds?
It's interesting because Lobelia syphilitica is rare in New England in the wild. And it also is from, a sort of wetland plant, wet woods plant. But in the garden, it's so much tougher and easier. So Lobelia syphilitica produces, well, Cardinalis produces a lot of plants too, but Lobelia syphilitica is a much more resilient landscape plant. That's the one that should be used in all the rain gardens. But it too, when people, if you are one of those gardeners that put down a lot of bark mulch every year, you do keep some of the natives from reproducing. Cardinal flower, Lobelia syphilitica, even Columbine, that one tends to rot under the bark mulch. But I would say Lobelia syphilitica, that's the one that should be used in all the rain garden. It's really easy. And it's also extremely drought tolerant. Cardinal flower is not drought tolerant, but syphilitica is.
Good distinction. Do stored seeds need air? So do they have to be stored in a mesh bag or something like a paper bag, or can they be stored in glass jars?
So any of the seeds that can be stored dry, it is fine to collect, and I'm assuming, the other thing that's in the DOT manual that everybody should read is the protocols for collecting seeds. Like for instance, I really would like people to start propagating before they take on collecting, but you need to correctly identify the species when it's in bloom, check to make sure it's not a protected species, in which case you absolutely can't collect the seed. If it is not on your land, you need to ask permission. And, typically you cannot collect from botanical gardens or parks or public lands. And then you need to know how to handle the seed. Like, is it one that you can collect in a paper bag, or do you need to put it in a Ziploc bag and rush home and clean it and sow it right away? So it's going to depend on the species. So that's all outlined in the DOT manual for those species that I covered. So if it's asters, anything like that, you can just store them in a paper bag. And then let's say on New Year is a great time to do your big fall winter seed sowing. Just sow them. What we do is after we've dried all of our seeds, you need to let those dry seeds air dry. Then we clean them and then we store them in glass jars and then we package them up in small batches. And all of this is stored in the refrigerator. You store seeds in glass jars in the refrigerator, they can stay, many species can stay viable for at least a couple years and many for even more years than that.
Very good. Can you clarify what soil mix you recommend for starting the seeds?
I just recommend a good compost-based organic potting soil. I don't like those sterile, obviously chemical-based potting soils or one with, a lot of the traditional potting soils all have fertilizer in it all the time, sometimes even the ones with the little plastic coatings, but which become, Osmocote, you see those little balls on it, that becomes plastic waste. We've all heard the news about the terrible plastic waste out there. So get a good compost base versus I find those do much better than the ones with the mycorrhizal fungi, like one where it's a sterile potting mix that's been inoculated with mycorrhizal. And the problem I have with that is it's just a mycorrhizal fungi that can be cultured in a laboratory and marketed and sold. It's kind of the same way as eating miso or yogurt to get your microbial community in your stomach versus buying a pill of it. So just a good one that has some organic compost in it, and you want to make sure it's been hot composted, not, unless you're really good at hot composting your own compost pile. The point is you don't want to have weed seeds in it. When I was at Garden in the Woods, there was no organic potting soil available back then, and so I made our own, where I bought, from back then in the 90s was when there were starting to be a couple operations doing commercial composting, and you could get it sifted. So you can make your own with hot composted compost, mixing it with sand and vermiculite. But you can just use any good organic compost-based potting soil mix. If you're growing some really drought-loving plants like butterfly milkweed or Scotch bellflower or spotted bee balm, it helps to cut the potting soil with coarse sand, because a lot of plants hate a really heavy organic matter potting soil, particularly if they're in plastic pots. Usually for germinating the seed, you can just use all the same potting soil, but like let's say you're growing butterfly milkweed, once you are moving them to a bigger pot, definitely cut the soil with coarse sand because they love gritty soil.
And what is your reliable source for the sand to cover them?
You can get, you can just get bags from the hardware store. It's called coarse builder sand, and it says right on it, no chemical, there's no de-icing chemicals. It's what you don't, the sandbox sand has kind of been sifted to be all the same size and really fine. What you want is, it's the kind of sand that's often mixed in with concrete, but the point is you want it without de-icing chemicals. It just I'm trying to think of the brand name. It's heavier than hell. It's about a 40-pound bag. You can use, if it's more sand than you need, you can sprinkle it on your walkway when it's icy. But it says right on it, coarse builder sand and what it's called. And I get it just at various hardware stores.
Okay. And are hulls not recommended for covering?
Oh, no, definitely not.
Okay.
That's later when you've got plants and you need to mulch it. Usually let's say you have a nursery and you're potting these up for sale and you want to mulch them using like cocoa bean hulls, but no, I would not do that in the first year of any of these seedlings. And you shouldn't have any weed problem if you've used a good organic base potting soil. If you want to make a growing bed to sow the seeds in instead of pots, I would still put a couple inches of the organic potting soil on top, maybe mixed with a little sand, because I can guarantee any soil you have has a lot of weed seed in it, unless you've, treated it with a flame torch or covered it with black plastic or something.
Okay.
And the nice thing about sowing the seeds in pots is they all grow at different rates. So when you sow them different seeds in a growing bed, when it comes time to transplant them, different ones are ready to move at different times. So I like to do it all in pots.
Okay.
I think it's easier to manage.
All right. And can you remind us about the watering? You mentioned that the sand will dry out and you'll see it, but what do you do watering wise in the winter?
So when let's say you go home and sow some in the next week or so, or two, you can do it inside because it's probably going to be cold outside. If you want, you can water them before you carry them outside, and particularly if you've sowed some fluffy seeds like the asters, you might want to, just in case it's windy outside, you can just put your pots in a dish of water, or you can just make sure you use a watering can that has a rain thing just to water the top, but then carry them outside, cover them with wire. Snow, rain, you don't have to water them in the winter. It's come spring, usually starting in mid to late April, depending how far south you are and depending on what the weather is like. Ideally we have plenty of cold, wet, just the kind of weather that farmers hate is perfect for native seed germination in the spring, where it's cold and damp and wet all of April. But if for some reason you have a week that's not raining in late April, then I would start checking them every couple of days. And that's one of the reasons you want to have the ungerminated seed flats in the shade, is they won't dry out as quickly. Once they germinate, if they're a sun-loving species like butterfly milkweed, then you can move it in the sun. But it's not in the winter that you need to worry about the water. It's come spring.
Even in a winter like this that has had virtually no snow?
Yeah, I mean, no. I mean, if you didn't water them, like let's say I was sowing some today, it's supposed to be dry here in Maine for the next 5 or 6 days, I would water them just, to get them going on the stratification. But no, I never watered them in the winter.
Okay.
But it wouldn't hurt it, but you shouldn't need to.
Okay.
When they're frozen, it might look like they're dry. It's just because they're frozen.
And when you pot up from the 4-inch up to the next size gallon or whatever, do you leave them in a clump or are you dividing them right then?
I leave them in a clump. If you had 100 seedlings in that pot, you could divide that pot of 100 seedlings into 4 clumps and then put each one in a gallon pot to give them all more growth. But if you separate them out, which you can do, and which you would if you were a commercial nursery, you are going to disturb the root system more, and you're going to have to fuss over them, keep them in full shade for a week, and you will set them back a little. So if you just move them all as a clump, they kind of can push each other out a little bit. It's much less disruptive to them, and they won't miss a beat on their growth. Versus if you divide them, they will, miss a week or two of potential growth.
Right. And just a clarification, you are recommending potting soil and weed-free compost as opposed to just digging soil in your yard because of the weeds?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. How much do you divide the plants then after in the fall? Is that when you would pull them apart down to individuals?
So depending what it is, let's say it's some New England aster, and let's say I want to plant some of my pot of 100, I want to put a couple in my garden, then I would plant those as clumps of 9 or 10, and then the next year you'll have a beautiful bushy plant. Then let's say I wanted to put the rest out in my meadow, I would take a shovel and I'd wait, and both of this I would do in September sometime usually, or early October. I would take a shovel, make a slice in my meadow, preferably after it rained, and just poke one seedling in and move on and slice the soil, put them in. The fall is such a great time to transplant, because you just have to water it right when you did it, and then you don't have to do anything else. So it depends. If you're trying to have them look more garden-esque, then I do them as clumps. If it's a tree seed, or depending on the kind of shrub, I might do them individually, or sometimes we'll do a couple together depending on what the shrub is.
Okay. And can you share some tips on a few specific plants? Closed gentian, wintergreen, and pycnanthemum?
Okay. Closed gentian, those seeds you can sow now into March, probably is good enough to give them cold, and then they germinate in the spring. The gentians, they're easy to germinate. They hate being transplanted. So they're kind of one of the exception where I might, instead of planting them, 50 seeds in a pot together, I might do 5 seeds in a bunch of small pots, so that I can then not have to divide them up more. That's an exception. That's not true of most species, but gentian for some reason is really sensitive to transplanting. Wintergreen, so those seeds, they're little teeny seeds. You can still find the seeds now. You can just take a thumb and split open the little red fruit and sprinkle them out, and they actually oddly don't need a winter cold period either. So they are one that you could play around indoors if you're good at growing things under lights. If you're not, just sow them. I'd still sow them now and put the pot outside, just a very light covering of sand, because they're little teeny seeds. They're very slow growing, I will warn you that. It's interesting, there's a lot of wintergreen available for sale now, and I think it's all coming from a greenhouse grower, or a lot of it is in Canada, who I'm guessing they're seed grown, but they're all done in a greenhouse, and they are heavily fertilized. And I just find that while they look beautiful when you buy them, they don't tend to adjust easily to the landscape. So I think growing them outdoors is really important, and not pumping them up with a lot of fertilizer. I grow all my plants organically. The first summer, if you think the foliage is looking a little yellow, you can use some seaweed extract. You don't need all that. Again, these are not like broccoli or tomato or garden annuals that have been bred to like a lot of nutrients. They really don't need that. But if for some reason you think the foliage looks a little too yellow, just use some seaweed. You can either spray it on the foliage, or you can put it in the watering can and water them with that.
Okay, and because we're running very late, I'm just going to take one last question for you, and that's, are the genotypes of the seeds that you're propagating in Maine suitable for planting in landscapes in Metro West Boston?
Yes, we're all in the same bioregion, so yes, I think they are.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. You've shared an amazing amount of information, Heather, and have inspired all of us to start seeds as quickly as we can. Just drop whatever you're doing and get some good potting soil.
Good. I hope everyone will visit our beautiful website. We're a nonprofit. Think about joining. You get the benefit of a 10% discount on the seeds. You get part of our free member call-ins, and you get a copy of our annual publication, Wild Seed. And thank you, Penny, for this opportunity to present digitally, even though I really miss seeing people's faces, it is a great way to reach a broad audience.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for attending, and good luck with your seed starting efforts.